super excited to be here to help facilitate this discussion in this new seat that I'm in at Efficiency Canada. Just a little bit about Efficiency Canada. We are singularly focused on advancing policies that support energy efficiency. So a bit of a switch from the work that I was doing with Penman Institute. So we position ourselves as Canada's voice on an energy efficient economy. We see that we're in an energy transition, which is going to bring change and disruption. We know that electrification is going to increase demand, clean electricity and system build-out will raise rates. Regional impacts on jobs will lead to political polarization, which Dylan's already spoken to this morning, and upheaval. The energy transition is going to be bumpy for Canada's most vulnerable populations. So we take the perspective that energy efficiency makes the energy transition easier and more affordable to implement. Reducing energy demand will be key to shielding us from impacts, such as by improving affordability. But also investing in energy efficiency creates meaningful jobs in Canadian communities, supports economic resilience, and addresses climate change. We are housed at Carleton University. It's located on the unceded Algonquin territories. And we advance energy efficiency policy solutions using three interrelated parts. Research, to identify relevant ideas and insights that inform policy. Communications, to shape public policy conversations. And engagement, to unify the kind of scattered energy efficiency sector for greater advocacy. So in the service of energy efficiency, we focus on buildings. That's my, favorite topic. Appliance and equipment standards, utility demand-side management, market transformation of business models and workforce, and energy poverty. So energy poverty has been a focus at Efficiency Canada since it was established in 2018. And my colleague, Abhilash Kantamneni, or most know him just as Abby, he leads this work and he would have loved to have been here today. He's currently living on the East Coast and it wasn't practical. So I have the pleasure of facilitating today's discussion on climate resilience and public health. There are bios on your tables. So I'm just going to say, oh, thanks, Dylan. I'm just going to, give names, titles, and everybody's sort of prepared a statement of like what they want to bring to the conversation today. So a bit of framing. So Leya Behra is the Deputy Director of Climate Action, City of New Westminster. And she's going to bring the perspective of what is actually happening on the ground in the city. Michael Schwandt is the Medical Health Officer with Vancouver Coastal Health and a Clinical Associate Professor in the UBC School of Population and Public Health. He's going to really press the big red button on the urgency and to raise alarms about the clear and present danger of climate change on public health. Robert Patterson is a staff lawyer with a Tenant Resource and Advisory Center. He's going to vent a little bit about how the legal system can both be a barrier to keeping tenants climate safe, but also give a little hope about how it can also be a solution. And Lisa Westerhoff, who I'm pretty sure most of you know, is the principal owner of Westerhoff Climate Strategies. She's been around and has learned that no one is acting alone, and we have much to build on. So. Yeah, so if you could help me welcome them to the stage. So we're just going to kind of jump right into some questions. We've discussed kind of the topic areas, and I want to start with Leya. Maybe could you kick us off with a grounding in what cities are really wrestling with at the human level, day to day?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be amongst so many people from various different areas who are all thinking about these hard topics and really centering their work around people. I'll probably keep this pretty brief because I'm really excited to hear from everyone else. And the things that we're grappling with in Westminster these days is how to keep our residents safe in our changing climate. New Westminster is hit particularly hard through the heat dome in terms of our number of fatalities in our community based on our building types, our housing forms, and our housing types that people live in, and our population. So we really struggle with centering our work around our community and our people and how to keep them safe. We're, right now I'll maybe focus my talk around where we're looking in terms of keeping people safe in extreme heat. Our city has a standards of maintenance bylaws. That's not necessarily common across every municipality in British Columbia. It's actually quite few. We struggle with the age and housing type of the buildings and what they can do technically, how to actually feasibly upgrade them to withstand the rising temperatures. We've been really looking a lot at how to regulate or how to kind of support our residents through that standards of maintenance, through just having a common understanding of what a habitable home is. But there is a challenge around how do you actually enforce this? We don't want to try to bring out regulations that are not enforceable. It's not good for the community and it's not good for us as well. We do have some work that we're able to advance. We're currently in a notice period for a bylaw to prohibit the prohibition of not allowing, I said too many negatives there. Prohibit the prohibition on air conditioner usage. Maybe that's right. Make sure people can plug in what they need to plug in to keep themselves safe, whatever that technology is. And we're hopeful that is going to continue to move forward and be applicable. I think we're challenged with looking at things like building codes, existing buildings, the ability to, I think the seismic is a good example of things where we've set standards in the future and there's dates and there's timelines and that is something that building owners can work towards. It kind of puts everyone on a level playing field. There's a concern in our municipality with a patchwork of regulation, the patchwork of supports that we will risk alienating the building owners in our community, or they will feel that it's punitive and want to move their buildings elsewhere or sell their buildings. We won't want to lose housing in our community by being viewed as a municipality that is one-sided. So this patchwork of regulation is a challenge, and we really are focused on how to do this in a way that's intentional, supports building owners, supports our tenants, but also advocating maybe more for a more provincial lens on how to move forward. So those are some of the things we're struggling with as we kind of go through the context of supporting our community, but also doing it in a way that truly will not result in unintended consequences.
Lisa's saving me. Yeah, thanks for that, Leya. I mean, I think that's a really fair point about the complexities that you guys are dealing with all the time, just in day-to-day, let alone trying to think about what's going to happen in the future. And I think that fine point of like being enforceable is something that people don't always understand. We just want to go, just put the hammer down, make it happen. How do you actually make it happen? But I think that some of how you make it happen is really understanding the urgency. And Michael, can you, maybe speak to, climate change really is now a household term, but if you can give us that sense of like how urgent it is that we start to address it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Betsy. And thanks for having me here today. It's a real privilege to see a lot of familiar faces, folks I've had a chance to work with over the years, and many new partners as well. Going back to the intro from Dylan, jotted down the wording. One of the goals today, looking for a vision of a more just energy and housing system. And from a public health perspective, that's so impactful when we think of the role of housing and energy security in the protection and promotion of health. We've seen what can happen in the absence of that. Looking back at the 2021 BC heat dome, we know that 619 people with great certainty passed away due to extreme heat within the period of just about a week. And these were people who, by and large, were living, these deaths occurred in their own homes, in indoor spaces, spaces that by design, by policy, were overheated to an unsafe degree, to a dangerous degree. And these are solvable problems. We know that when we look at cold, for example, we have the ability to design against that. And we have the ability to do that against heat. We see this in other jurisdictions around the world as well. So these are solutions that are not simple, they're complex, but they're within our grasp. And I think that what you said about expanding our ambition is so true and so necessary right now. And it's not just extreme heat. We know that wildfire smoke, which is another consequence of climate change, the intrusion of particulate matter into indoor spaces, can have health impacts that both acutely impact folks, especially people at higher risk, like younger children, older adults, people with pre-existing health conditions, but can also have longer-term health effects that we're learning more and more about over time that can show up years later and continue to affect people, whether that's in terms of cognitive health, mental health, and other health impacts down the line. So this really is a public health imperative, and as well the indirect impacts related to energy poverty, people needing to make decisions between heating or cooling their home and food, for example, on other necessities of life is something that's very real from a health perspective. So I'll have a chance to talk more on the panel about some of the solutions that are out there, but absolutely, this is a public health priority, and thanks for having us here today from a health perspective.
Thanks for that. Michael, yeah, we do tend to think most immediately about heat, but I think, that combination of fire, smoke, and whatever else we're staring down at the same time, I think is something that we really do need to keep in mind. And perhaps that trend of moving to climate adaptation is because of that kind of heightened awareness. So, Robert, I kind of gave away your shtick here, but how is the legal system failing tenants? And maybe give us a little bit of sunshine on how it might be sort of working.
I'll try. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I guess there's sort of two problems I think that the law can solve and also sometimes creates. You have sort of for tenants who are living in homes now that are not safe in a changing climate. You need to make sure you equip them with the right legal tools and protections to sort of protect themselves and make their home safe in cases of extreme weather events. So as we saw back in the 2021 heat dome, there are tenants that tried to plug in fans or air conditioning units and were threatened with eviction or even received eviction notices because of that. And the law did not assist them. There is no right to a cool unit. There is no requirement a landlord meet certain requirements, some similar sort of standards of cooling that they might have to meet for heat otherwise. In the provincial legislation, heating is an essential service and cooling is not. It's a reality, of course, of just the shifting climate. What is becoming necessary is just, and it's essential to sort of safe and accessible units is just changing. But the law needs to change to recognize that. And how that happens and where that's recognized will have to sort of be figured out on a policy level. It's interesting to hear like New West, adopting like a rule like that in their bylaws can honestly feed back into provincial legislation because a lot of the time the Residential Tenancy Act points to local bylaws and saying this is what a landlord has to do. But in a perfect world, you'd also have a broader recognition of that right to a cool unit, the right at least in a heat emergency, be able to plug in a fan and not be worried that you're going to get evicted for it. So that's something that has to sort of those sort of changes that have to happen now while people are in their current homes in this current situation to protect their lives essentially. But then there's also I think the bigger question of what do we do like long term, the goal to change the retrofit housing, build new accessible and safe housing through redevelopment. Both of those processes currently pose significant risk to tenants who are in those homes. So the risk of redevelopment and displacement from redevelopment is no new story. I think every sort of major transit project I can think of in the Lower Mainland has always resulted in a further displacement of thousands of tenants from what used to be low income, low rent homes, primarily occupied by folks who are more vulnerable, folks with lower incomes, seniors, folks on fixed incomes, folks on disability. they're often the ones who are, the first out the door, the first to be pushed out of the communities by those projects. And so you need adequate protections in place for those folks. Things like the tenant relocation and protection policies. City of Vancouver has a very good one for the Broadway plan in particular. Burnaby has a very solid one, but a devil is always in the details and in the enforcement of those policies. And that's where whether the rubber hits the road is an interesting question, and how effective how those policies can be enforced and what cities will do to enforce them is, I think, still a very big open question that tenants need to have more certainty there. But even in the case of things like green retrofits, currently provincial legislation allows landlords to pass on and download the costs of their building retrofits to tenants if they qualify for an additional rent increase for capital expenditures. The problem is the provincial legislation is like a piece of Swiss cheese. It's more loophole than anything else. You can qualify almost anything for that, which has led to landlords trying to pass off all kinds of ridiculous things as capital expenditures to be able to jack rates up on tenants. But specifically for things like any kind of green retrofit or any kind of thing to make it more accessible, the danger you would face is that a tenant in what is now affordable housing, a landlord does that kind of work, applies for that rent increase, that rent now rises even faster than inflation, even faster than their wages or their fixed income, and in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, they're now pushed out of that housing because they can't afford it anymore. They've been, gentrified in place, essentially. So that's the risk that has to be mitigated against. That's a problem created by the law that we should change, and that it can solve by going away, or at least being written in a more cohesive and clear way. Anyways, was that a sufficient vent? I think
That was good. It was a good little vent. Yeah, thanks. I feel like we might get to some more, so it's good. Yeah, I mean, the whole legal system always just seems like this weird little word cloud for me. So I think, having voices where you're kind of mapping through, these are the actual impacts of what this, what these regulations do, I think is so critical. Lisa, yeah, you're next. Many of these things, we know there are repeats in the challenges that people are facing in communities particularly. So can you speak to some of those more commonalities of the challenges and barriers that are being shared that we can maybe collectively solve?
Absolutely. Maybe first I'll just give a bit of context of why I'm on this panel. So there was a report that was recently released that I led with a group of consultants, including Introba and Focal Engineering. It was all on how to safeguard or support indoor thermal safety in existing multi-unit residential buildings in British Columbia. It was commissioned by four organizations, so shout out to City of North Vancouver, Vancouver Coastal Health, Metro Vancouver, and City of Vancouver. So just want to contextualize. So that report contained about 30 or so recommendations that local governments can take or explore. So that includes regional governments, regional authorities, and municipalities to help support indoor thermal safety in existing buildings in British Columbia. Just a little bit more context before I answer your question. And what I guess to also explain what I'm bringing a little bit more in terms of a broader perspective is that work is really excitingly being leveraged by the C40 Cities Network, and so we're now supporting Toronto, Washington, DC, New York, and Austin in trying to think through what an indoor temperature requirement could look like for them and their building communities. And so that's the kind of perspective that I'll try to bring here. Which can really be summarized as it's really hard everywhere to try to address this problem. I've typically worked in climate change policy, energy efficiency, electrification policy, and I also have some background in climate adaptation and resilience, and so this is not a new sort of space for me, but what I realized in starting to look at indoor thermal safety specifically is that all the incumbent challenges associated with electrification of buildings are also here for indoor thermal safety. What changes is the urgency that Michael spoke to already. This is no longer a midterm or long-term challenge. I mean, not that climate change ever really was. Like, we know we've had to do this for decades now. But now we're talking about immediate physical consequences for the most vulnerable people in the community. And so to me, the challenge is how do we bridge that gap between all the things that we knew we needed to do for electrification and providing active cooling and reducing our emissions in buildings with now this, how do we make sure people are safe tomorrow for the next heat wave and to other incoming climate impacts as well. So what do we do about that? I think one of the main messages that I'll try to get across here today is that there are things to do in the short term. We can make changes in the short term and to support those most vulnerable. There are programs that were already mentioned at the beginning of the session this morning around air conditioner distribution programs and others that can help get people, safe in the interim. But we need to think about that longer term transition as well. How do we make sure that owners are thinking about and actually starting to implement the measures that are going to keep people safe in the long term, that don't inadvertently impact the grid, that allow us to reduce our emissions, and that don't inadvertently burden those people who now have to potentially pay for cooling, who may already not be able to afford it. Maybe one more thing I'll just say is, I think, again, referencing some of the statements that Dylan made at the beginning that around the fact that we have about 10% living in energy poverty in Canada today, and I think it was 32% living in financial hardship. This is a really crucial part of this conversation, and what was really interesting to learn as we worked with New York and DC is that even in places where air conditioning is prevalent, so for example in DC, 90% of people in that community, or maybe it's 95%, of people living in Washington, D.C. have access to air conditioning. And 40% of those people said, I don't always use it because I'm trying to reduce my energy costs. And so there's going to be a very similar pattern, I'm sure, emerging here as we start to say, we think cooling is the answer. Cooling's not just the answer. Making sure people can use that cooling is part of the answer. So that's where I'll leave that opening statement for now.
Thank you. I grew up in Ontario. It was like standard, you had air conditioning. And honestly, I spend most of my summer asking my mother, Mom, did you put the air conditioning on? Because she's like, well, I put it on a little bit at night, but I don't want to overuse it. Mom, you can afford your air conditioning. And it's a very real fear that's, I think, highlights the practicality of, there's the front end solving of, okay, we can implement these things, and then there's the back end actual, sort of executing of them and what all the factors are that are, sort of impacting that decision making. So I'm going to come back to the other end of the table and come back to you, Leya. So what is New West doing really to kind of put people at the center of the planning? And I'd like to hear sort of where you really see the opportunity for coordination. So where you've seen, a good coordination between regions or governments that's been really successful.
So I think we started talking really seriously about work plans at our city that are dedicated to just talking about heat in 2022, really. In 2023, we had put together big plans for our council around partnerships across our social planning divisions, our emergency management and operations, our fire crews, and our climate team and electric utility, in order to look at different approaches and different avenues in which to support our residents through heat events. So we laid out what are all of our short-term actions, whether it's our Hey Neighbor Collective, our programs for community connection to help just check on people, create those connections, prevent social isolation so we can know when someone is in despair in situations where during the heat dome there was actually a lack of awareness in some cases due to social isolation. We have partnerships with various health groups as well as our Fraser Health authorities in order to provide additional supports to those who, one group, for example, would be with Praxis, who are looking at providing personal cooling that is not necessarily active cooling devices directly to residents in our community who are impacted, and we're looking at other building scale work with them. We're just are actively planting a lot of more mature sized trees as mature as you can when you're planting, but rather than the smaller ones in order to try to speed up. That's obviously got a long-term impact. And we had actually invested in free air conditioners for rental buildings, for building owners to put into common rooms. It was actually just before the BC Hydro program had been announced as well. So there were some short-term things. We'd increase the number of watering stations. We're working with our nonprofits to open their doors during heat events and helping support their costs to operate those longer hours during those heat events. So trying to create cooling spaces that were more comfortable for community members to actually go to than just a traditional cooling center, which we're operating in the same places that are warming centers, where we have different populations accessing them. So there's a lot of short-term actions we're really looking at in order to support that near term, while we still worked on things like how to support tenants through regulations, how to support landlords through utility-related programs. Westminster has an electric distribution utility, so we have maybe a bit of additional ability to kind of look at delivering incentive programs through an electric utilities lens as well. So there's sort of these three areas that we're trying to work through, whether it's short-term actions, regulations for supporting tenants, but then also programs that can help support the building owners. It's challenging, but I think coming together with all the knowledge, the last part you said was how do we do things collectively? The stuff Lisa was just mentioning, I think that information sharing, that collective goal, the collective action and advocacy for trying to remove the burden of this patchwork, as I mentioned before, of regulation, this patchwork of support, to have a broader long-term systemic change in our province. We need bigger provincial support to move those forward.
That really resonates. We stole the term resilience really from like ecosystem resilience, right? And it was about, how readily can we weather what's happening? And then how quickly can we rebound? And like down to that very social aspect of just check in on your elderly neighbor to make sure they're putting on their air conditioning or they're not just sort of stuck in their house. But I think that, I think I wrote down 6 different things that you mentioned, it was in partnership. And so it just looks like a kind of a mapping of a strategy, really. So Robert, I'm going to come back to you. Given the urgency, because it's fun, given the urgency of climate change, like, do you think it'd be faster or more effective to just like have a revolution in terms of what we do? Or like, are we at a kind of a reform phase here where we have some real opportunities to make some real changes?
That's a good question. I think when it comes to like tenant rights, even written more broadly than in this particular context, there deserves to be a revolution in terms of how it operates. What's something like concrete I can offer on this? So one of the things that we experienced during the 2021 heat dome, and tenants were, I think, one of the big sort of lessons learned, less takeaways, was that in buildings where you had tenants working together in community, you saw much more positive outcomes, folks relying on each other, sharing, if someone had a space that was cool or knew of a common space that was cooled, working together to check in on each other. And that is the way I approach a lot of these questions is because of the nature of our legal system, is on a very individual, atomized basis. What is your individual tenant's rights against your landlord? Your landlord might have signed contracts with other people in the building, but that doesn't really matter to you. Like, all that matters is your legal rights against this one other person. And that model limits a lot of things you can do on a broad scale in general, but particularly where you have something affecting an entire building. The closest you might get is that tenants can come together and make their applications to the residential tenancy branch and then ask nicely for them to be joined together and heard at the same time, which isn't exactly community building style to be in a quasi lawsuit together. But I'm not sure why I'm bringing this up, as a weird history lesson. Back when the Residential Tenancy Act was first, the original version was first drafted in the, I'm going to say late 70s, early 80s, it was sort of this concession to tenant groups that had sprung up complaining about issues, and the province had to choose kind of between two models. Either what it went with, which is this individual, rights model, or a union-based model, more based on the labor movement, where you could actually you'd have tenant unions bargaining in some level, whether it's municipal or neighborhood or building-wise, and those unions themselves would have rights, and you'd have people be able to work together in their buildings and have them forced to be recognized by the landlord. Well, we went the individual way, and that's led to, I think there are some positive things, and also a lot of negative things about that. But in terms of bringing out big change for tenants and protecting folks in their buildings, it's along the way to getting, making sure housing is safe and accessible and affordable for everybody. I think the biggest fear that so many tenants have, and the reason so many tenants come out at City Hall meetings to be concerned about development in their communities, is because they know that it's a threat to them. And for a tenant in an unsafe but still affordable home that they have is better than the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen when it's torn down. Am I going to be able to afford a unit in the new building? The answer to that is almost certainly no, unless you have some kind of protection that the city is saying they will provide to you. But what will happen if the landlord defaults? What will happen if they say no? Because there have been cases of that where tenants have been promised you can come back into your old unit at the same rent. All of a sudden, the landlord is reneging on the deal or is zigzagging on their interpretation of the contract they signed with the city, and now you're a single tenant left do you want to sue the city? Do you want to sue the landlord? Do you want to sue both of them together? You probably don't. You probably just need to go move on and try and find housing because it's that's your life. So, revolution is my final answer. Yeah.
Just quickly before I move on, are there examples of that kind of tenant union model that?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure of any place that recognizes legal status for tenant unions. If it happens anywhere, you'd imagine it would be Europe. Europe, yeah. But I can't think of any particular examples.
Yeah, it'd be something to kind of noodle over because it might be an interesting model to look at. Yeah, cool. Interesting because there's a commonality there, right? Is it if we can foster community, at least the immediate dangers of these climate threats, we can address. If we think about how we're building houses, even to this day, our buildings, it doesn't really foster community well. And we have this kind of decline in the missing middle housing model, which I think did do that a little bit better. And I think we forget that sort of social aspect and how critical it is in terms of the actual health and safety functioning of the building. Okay, so we need a revolution. Michael, I'm turning to you. What are some of the stories that we need to be telling to light fires under policymakers and industry leaders and other influencers in this space?
Well, sure. I think some of the data that's out there, I think, can paint one picture, and I think the direct human experiences are something else, and of course relate to that data. And related to what Robert was describing, we receive calls at our public health program from people who are saying, we've seen what you presented. We saw your messages in the media about cooling your own space, about checking in on your neighbors, thinking about people who might be most vulnerable. And meanwhile, we can't put a portable air conditioner in our space. We can't even think about putting in a heat pump due to prohibitions, whether that's through the Strata Property Act or the Residential Tenancy Act. People are coming up against barriers, whether they're renting or in some cases even the owners of their own unit. And they've asked our public health staff to try to interpret and parse some of this. And rather than calling Robert, we actually tried to do our best and say in many cases you might need to actually prove to the RTB, the Residential Tenancy Board, that you have a specific health need. Again, this atomized, one at a time process that we take, that you have a health need that might require a doctor's note, documentation, that you have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or some other condition, and thus the prohibition on you putting in an air conditioner is unconscionable. This is what vulnerable tenants, people who might be income secure, might be facing other barriers to justice, are facing literally to protect their own health in their own home. And the idea that's proposed in some policies, and Lisa's described this in the really excellent report that was mentioned earlier, the possibility of flipping this to say, to ban these sorts of bans, to say as a default, people ought to be able to take those measures within their own home to create, whether that's passive cooling, things as simple as covers on windows that might help with the literal greenhouse effect that happens within people's spaces, air conditioning and heat pumps, that the default position ought to be that people can take these actions. And that to ban this should require that sort of action on the part of the landlord or the strata, not the other way around. And this is the sort of thing that flows very clearly from some of the stories that we hear when people are coming up saying, I'd like to take these actions, I might even have the resources to, or I'm seeking the resources to, but I just can't within the policy frameworks that affect my building or my unit. So these are, I think we try to, again, hear the data and also hear the people that are often working directly with us at the individual level or the organizational level, as many community-based organizations do.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, so maybe that is the revolution, is just getting the stuff out of the way, starting again. So banning the bans is the revolution. Okay, as the default. Okay, Lisa, how do we start pulling together in, we've used the word patchwork a few times, of progress, maybe not even on the negative side, that each of us is making.
Just solve the problem.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what Robert had to do. Yeah. I guess that's what we're here to do, isn't it? Try to figure out how to solve this. I guess when I hear patchwork, I have two sort of instincts. One is, of course, we don't want patchwork. We want consistency, at least regional consistency, because that makes everything easier from the perspective of an owner that needs to understand what they have to do to comply with the requirement. It makes it more consistent for the tenants and the occupants who will benefit from them. And so if we can't achieve provincial consistency in how we address this, I would love to actually see at least regional consistency. That being said, we have the BC Energy Step Code because of that patchwork, because the provincial government was sort of irritated to the point where it said, okay, everyone's doing something different, we're going to take this on, we're going to make it more consistent across the province. So in some ways, I feel like some sort of irritation as a patchwork in the short term might not be a terrible stepping stone to hopefully provincial consistency in how we address this issue. But to get there, we'll need to do more than just implement things willy-nilly. We'll want to kind of band together, advocate to the province for what we are looking for, things like right to cooling legislation, perhaps something like a standardized expectation around a standards of maintenance bylaw that includes provisions for cooling as well as for heating. So there are things that can be sort of advocated for at the provincial level. Assuming that that's not forthcoming anytime soon, I think, as I said, working at the regional level is, I think, what would be most useful. There is a lot to be gained from working together between the regional authorities and the local governments, even just as a starting point of pooling together what information do we have? What do we understand about this landscape? Where do we need to focus our resources first? What kinds of data do we have available to us that can help us identify what buildings are in greatest need, what households are in greatest need? What kinds of layers of information can we pull together from different sources, from the health authority, from the regional government, from municipalities, to understand where do we need to zero in on support quickly? And then I think there's also work to be done to figure out, well, how are we actually going to set a requirement? And that's the work that we're doing right now with the other 4 cities that I mentioned. And I see that there's a sort of a gradation of levels of stringency and impact that you can think about. On the kind of lower end of that scale, you can simply look to remove barriers. So things like, are there design covenants that prevent people from putting in external shading if they want to later on? Are there form and character guidelines that are preventing you from putting something on the exterior of your building? Are there simple prohibitions on installing something to the outside, including an air conditioning unit? So removing those as a starting point, absolutely. And then there's sort of that gradation that goes up to, full requirement for active cooling in all suites, full stop. That would be sort of the other end of the spectrum. And then there's the ones in between, a maximum indoor temperature requirement, is still pretty stringent, but allows some flexibility in terms of how an owner could go about achieving that. It doesn't neglect the role of passive measures, so things like shading, things like energy efficiency, envelope improvements, window operability. All those things are really important, especially if the power goes out, which it doesn't often do in BC, but it's not, an impossibility. And then the sort of cooling room, I think that's a really important interim measure, but there are, as I'm sure you all know, very many concerns around the accessibility of cooling rooms. Can people access it full stop? Is it reasonable for them to sit in a laundry room with an air conditioner for a day or 2 or 3? What happens if the temperatures are high overnight? We know, well, actually, Michael, you should speak to this more than me, but high overnight temperatures also are, I believe, are associated with higher rates of mortality and morbidity. So, cooling rooms, great interim measure, maybe not the final solution. So all this to say, I think I've gone on a little bit of a journey here. I think there's lots to think about and coordinate, not just municipally, but regionally. And thinking about what's the best first step to protect people in the near term, which I've mentioned a couple things, but then how do we work collectively to make sure that we are planning for the medium and the longer term? So what to me that looks like is supporting people today who need it the most and working with owners to get a plan in place to say, here's how you're going to transition over to a thermally safe building. Here are the financial support measures that we are going to include for you. Here's how we're going to support the tenants who may not be able to afford that, to pay for that cooling energy once it's installed. And to just, in all ways, I think, just recognize that there are challenges along the way and that we have to kind of collectively work to solve them and not just say, tenants good, owners bad. That's not going to get us very far, so we need to be able to understand the challenges that exist for everyone and work collectively to address them.
Yeah, with that we can wrap up. I'm just that was great. I think we have time for questions. Do you want? Does anybody have questions?
So we also have Slido, so feel free to, let me see if I can.
Okay, while we're doing that, do you guys have questions for each other?
I just wanted to make sure anyone didn't disagree with me, because I encourage disagreement on the panel. I think it makes it spicier. So, any disagreement? You don't have to.
Okay. I'm going to ask the first question that's up here, but I did see your hand, Melina, and I see yours, Chris. What are this is from Alison Conroy. What are some of the alternative options to AC each of you see that could be utilized to address future overheating?
There's like a little leg, sorry. So I think what we want to see ultimately is not a bunch of low efficiency air conditioners running at max capacity, taxing our grid and threatening brownouts and requiring massive upgrades to the electrical capacity of buildings. We want to see high efficiency heat pump units wherever possible, so just wanted to make that distinction. I think the air conditioning unit distribution program is wonderful. I'm not exactly sure on all the details, but we would definitely want to see them be, very specific models of high energy efficiency wherever possible. That is, to be honest, like when you think back to the heat dome, passive measures in most, I can't imagine, and I'm willing to be told that I'm wrong here, but I would hazard a guess that a combination of passive measures in that circumstance is not going to get you below 26 degrees Celsius or to a safe temperature. So I think we are looking at active cooling as a safeguard for especially the most vulnerable. Like that is kind of what we're talking about. However, I do want to underscore passive measures very important still. Can we reduce the need for active cooling by having improved building performance or envelope performance, better insulation, higher overall energy efficiency? That also helps to reduce the costs when you are running your air conditioning units. Operable windows for those shoulder seasons when it's not blazing hot, but that's sufficient to get people cool. Leya, anything else that you would add?
That's really helpful. That was a really good laundry list. I know, like even on the community side, so making sure there's good access to like green space. We're looking at the landscaping even around buildings for cooling, cool roof programs. Different things depending on the building type. Not all of them are as effective depending on the actual architecture of the building. But yeah, I completely want to reiterate the idea that the passive measures are really important because, again, as we've talked about energy poverty, the inability, I was really glad you mentioned the inability to just run an air conditioner regardless of whether they have access to one or not. It's very common across the southern United States. It's something that we have the ability to now have some foresight to plan for so that we don't go down that same route. So having those passive measures to really help manage the cost of your energy bills is really important, with that active cooling being the resort you need to like go to when you just really cannot keep the building cool, but it's not your primary go-to everyday item.
I also just wanted to say shading. I forgot to say shading. Very important.
Yeah, interesting to hear New West planting big trees. I wonder if they actually also survive longer, too.
It's kind of relative, like the big trees.
Yes,
Like I wish they were really big. Like you could take like a forestry. Like
Yeah,
no.
that'd be cool.
It takes a lot more work to get them going. It's like whatever. I am no expert on the tree side, but as I understand, there is more work and there is like a higher cost to kind of get them established, but and a higher cost to get them at that size. But where they're being prioritized for certain spots where it's deemed critical to try to really establish those trees as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and it speaks to the complexity, right? We've talked all the way from a laundry room to the urban landscape, right? Solving this one problem of keeping people safe in their homes. Thanks to, it's moving. Anna. Acorn, Toronto, and Calgary have tenant unions that have had some wins at the building level. Cool. So something to go look up at Acorn. Abhi would have known that right off the top of his head. But Melina, you had a question.
Yeah, I put it on my slide, but I just...
Oh, did you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I think something that's top of mind for me is we're doing our work at SEEK with the BC Retrofit Accelerator. We're trying to support strata owners. It's not just about tenants, and the affordability issues are real for owners, and there's lots of folks who can't afford to make ends meet if their parents paying daycare, if there's someone with a disability who has an income but they have to pay caregiving costs and other things. Anyway, I'm just kind of curious what thoughts would be from the committee about how do you reconcile that the affordability issues go beyond just the tenant component, but also landlords. Some of these investments at a whole building scale are really significant and absolutely needed. But anyway, I'd just like to hear thoughts on that, because I think, actually getting to the outcome of having accessible cooling and affordable energy for people needs sort of many folks to be able to contribute and be part of that solutions, but we don't always hear about that side of the equation. So I'm just curious what reflections or thoughts folks have on how do we again help sort of scale the solutions, which means affordability is a factor for many people.
So in case people didn't hear that, we need to recognize that affordability is also an issue for building owners. And so how do you kind of reconcile those two very real challenges? Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I think, Leya, do you have any thoughts? Or Robert, or Michael?
Well, I think you already said it very well, that the diversity of needs is really needs to be kept in mind here, that this does affect people who own their own homes as well as people who rent. And that was shown in the data from the BC Heat Dome as well, that both of those categories can certainly be at risk, even with the potential wealth involved in owning a home. The immediate material ability to cool that home is not necessarily guaranteed. And I think that's why this constellation of policies becomes so important. So we might talk about, and we ought to, the relationship between the landlord and the tenant at the level of the Residential Tenancies Act, but also looking at the building itself at the level of building codes, potentially at the Strata Property Act, and the ability for stratas to develop their properties to be safer, and certainly in the standards of maintenance bylaws as well. So I think that overall, thinking about not just any one quote type of person, but all of the different impacts. And this flows from, I think, going back to the data, and oftentimes it will be health data that we're able to examine and make sure that our policies, in fact, are targeted to the evidence and are equitable, and we don't just move along potential assumptions that might drive some of our work, but also look at the data that we have live and direct from our own health emergencies here in British Columbia.
I'll just add one quick thing, which is going to make your question sound like a plant, Melina, but the Zero Emissions Innovation Center's Strata Energy Advisor Program is a wonderful way to scale up support for strata owners. And I'm not sure if sort of cooling and thermal safety has been talked about as being integrated as part of that generally emissions and energy focused program, but I think that would be a great opportunity if not.
Okay, sorry, Chris, but I'm going to defer to the Slido. Maybe this is yours. What do you make of the changes to BC Hydro's AC program, now requiring a referral from provincial health care providers and not allowing people to income qualify?
And I definitely welcome the other panelists to join in here as well. From a public health perspective, we've had some opportunity to, let's say, inform the BC Hydro program. BC Hydro, Ministry of Health worked very hard on this to start it 2 years ago. And something on the order of 30,000 units will have gone out by the end of this summer, we are told, which is obviously a very large investment. I would say that this is an extremely important program. It continues to develop, and it will sound like a bit of potentially criticism, but I mean for it to be very constructive. I think that the identification of groups that might be at high risk or potentially benefit from this program continues to evolve, and I think that the appetite to bring evidence to bear on that has been reflected in the initial inclusion of people who are directly income qualified and self-referred, and then also clients of home care and home health programs through the Regional Health Authority. And when we think of the intersection of biomedical risk and social risk, social isolation that can place somebody at risk for illness due to extreme heat, essentially somebody who's qualified for home care or home health services is almost by definition at risk for the impacts of extreme heat by the very conditions that would qualify one for that service. However, we've gone back and informed BC Hydro, those folks are also receiving services in their home a few times a week, so there is a potential protection as well. And this year, the program actually expanded to include clients of mental health and substance use services, which is an extremely important group. Data from the BC Centre for Disease Control actually found that people living with schizophrenia were at extremely high risk during the BC heat dome and other mental health conditions as well. So I think that it's very important for that program to continue to be responsive to the health evidence, which in my observation, they have been. And I think that the narrowing of the qualification to require a health-based referral, I think has been my understanding, is a desire to make sure that it is targeted to the highest risk of all. But in my opinion, the income qualification is so stringent that most people with a low income as required for that program should have access to cooling, do experience a material barrier, again, almost by definition, because these income qualifications are so tight. So with more resources, which could potentially be made available, I don't think that we need the intersection of low income and extreme health need. I think that somebody with those very low incomes ought to receive support for this one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Back to that sharing. Leya, did you have something to add?
Sorry, I have a slight on the same topic, but a little bit to the side of it. And I just wanted to make a comment on one challenge we have in BC as it relates to some of these programs that are out there, and depending on what partner is delivering them. Not everyone in BC has access to all the same programs. There is a part of our BC territory that is supplied by Fortis BC Electric Utility, and that AC program was not originally accessible to anyone living in the Fortis BC Electric territory, which is in the interior of BC. And it's not a small number of people in terms of in general, and it is a warm part of the province. And it took a lot of advocacy for that area and that region to have access to these programs. So I think there's also maybe a challenge or a gap that we have in our utility framework with this assumption that BC Hydro services and BC Hydro programs are accessible to everyone in our province. I'm going to admit, I don't have an actual solution to that. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but there needs to be some better coordination amongst these two electricity providers when it comes to programs that I would deem as a public health emergency and a risk. Sorry, I totally just sidetracked there. But,
No, I think it's really important
worth
to
understanding
remember,
that
yeah.
not everybody actually has access to this program that we're all agreeing was really important.
Yeah, in the middle of the interior where our desert is. Yeah, this sort of leads into this next question. I'm not sure that these panelists can necessarily answer it, but maybe the way that we could frame it is like, what are the conversations you're having around the technical electrical barriers at the building level to all residents plugging into their air conditioning? Are we really worried about this, or are you having these conversations where you're trying to deal with this?
That sounds like Chris Higgins' question.
No, but it was Patrick Enright. I'll out him.
Patrick, you have a better answer to that question than we do. I think. I'll just very briefly say that everyone, I don't have the answer to that, and it is a perennial question across the 4 other cities that I have been working with. So it is not unique to British Columbia. This notion that a lot of our building stock is quite a bit older was built with much lower electrical capacity needs in mind. And so that is one of the challenges to saying, well, everyone should just get air conditioning or get a heat pump. It actually is a much more complicated problem than that. That is not unique to Vancouver, British Columbia, but I could not offer an opinion on how to resolve that.
Yeah.
So as a city that has an electric distribution utility owned by the municipality, happy to comment a little bit on this from my own department. It is a challenge. There's a little bit of a fear that we remove this prohibition on prohibiting air conditioners, got it right, and then the block turns off, and we have a different issue. Right now, our goal right now, on the flip side, like I said, we're working to try to protect tenants, but we're also trying to work to understand the challenges that landlords are facing and what can we do from our utility side to help support get there, to make sure that when a tenant wants to plug in the air conditioner, the building is clearly ready for all of the load. So we're doing a lot of research right now, understanding the building stock, understanding all of the rental buildings in our community. Technically, what is their capacity right now? What would be the difference between their current heating system? In some cases, if they're electrically heated right now, we actually think those buildings are going to be fine. What are we concerned about? So understanding where are those actual problems, and then working directly with those buildings in order to help find a pathway to get those upgrades done in those buildings and to work with those owners. Because we don't want to lose rental buildings in our community either. We are not trying to alienate building owners, or as you said, no one's necessarily the bad guy here. We need to just figure out how to get everybody moving forward in a way that both supports all of the residents and all of the businesses and housing providers in our community. But it is a real problem, but we can only solve that problem by actually taking the time to understand where it's a real problem.
So compassion on all sides, that no one is alone, and that we do have a lot of tools that we can collaborate on and help to deliver together. And success really needs to be measured, by holding health, resilience, and equity of people at the center of everything we do. Also, it's time for a revolution. Thanks, guys.